For 10 years, he poured only one cup of coffee. No footsteps on the porch, no voice in the next room. Just the slow rhythm of chores, the dog aging quietly beside him, and the hollow sound of wind between fence posts. He wasn't waiting anymore. Until one stormy evening, a young woman in a soaked wedding dress collapsed on his porch barefoot, breathless, and carrying nothing but a torn satchel and a silence deeper than his own. He didn't know her name. She didn't ask to be saved. But something in both of them had been waiting for this moment. Was she running from a man or from a life she never chose? And could two people, both abandoned in different ways, build something gentle where nothing ever grew? This isn't just a story about love. It's a story about staying after everything told you to run. Keep watching. The prairie remembers what we try to forget. At the northern edge of Kansas, a wooden house stood still on the prairie like time had abandoned it. Its shingled roof had faded to the color of dust, the chimney chipped, and the wind chime on the porch gave a gentle, weary jingle, more like a sigh than a song. That house belonged to Elam Granger, a man who had lived alone for 10 years. Elam wasn't exactly lonely. He had horses, chickens, an old dog named Jasper, and enough to do that, there was little room for stray thoughts about what couldn't be changed. Like the woman who had once promised to marry him, only to leave behind a damp letter and a colder winter than most. Since then, Elam hadn't poured tea for two, hadn't set out an extra chair at the table, and never fixed the warped bedroom door on the right, the one she used to crack open for the morning sun. Every day, Elam rose before dawn, brewed bitter coffee, and walked out to the field while the dew still clung to his trousers. He wrote no letters, expected no replies, and never looked down the road that led to town. The outside world was for other people. Elam had shut his heart with wood, stronger than any oak in these plains. In town, folks called him the orphan rancher, not because he had no kin, but because he refused to belong to anyone. They'd whisper, he once loved a girl pretty as autumn light. She ran off and he hasn't looked up since. And he hadn't, until one rainy afternoon. The rain came the way autumn slips over the prairie, silent, unannounced. Wind howled through the eaves. Jasper gave a low, weary howl and tucked himself under a blanket. Elam was mending a saddle strap when he heard a thud on the porch. Not wind, not some stray critter. He stood, opened the door, and there she was. A woman collapsed on the steps, her wedding dress soaked through mud clinging to the hem like each step had been a battle. Her face was pale, hands still gripping a small leather satchel chest, rising just enough to show she was alive. Elam didn't ask her name, didn't ask where she'd come from. He lifted her gently like he'd done it before in a dream, and carried her inside. Jasper barely lifted his head, then settled back down as if even the old dog knew something buried had started to stir. In the room that hadn't been touched in a decade, Elam lit the stove, brewed ginger tea, and wrapped her in a thick wool blanket. On the table, 2 teacups were used for the first time in years. Elam sat on the edge of a chair watching the woman sleep. He didn't know who she was, but he knew one thing: the hollow in his chest, the one he'd accepted as permanent, was slowly filling with something. Not fear, not inconvenience, but memory. Something he thought had died. A man can live without hope, but when hope returns, it doesn't knock, it crashes in, like a storm. Who is she? And why did she come to the place no one ever comes? The rain had passed, but its memory lingered in the soaked earth and the hush that settled over the prairie. A fog hung low across the pasture, like a blanket left too long over a wound. Inside the house, the fire crackled steady, casting a soft orange halo on the woman's pale skin. She woke just before sunrise. Her first breath was sharp, like the first breath after breaking the surface of deep water. Her eyes fluttered open, not with panic but confusion, the kind that blooms in a stranger's bed wrapped in warmth you didn't ask for. Elam was already seated in the corner, sipping his coffee like nothing in the world had changed. But everything had. He didn't speak. Not yet. Just offered her a cup of tea, steam curling from the rim like a whisper. She took it, hands trembling. "I found you on the porch," he said, voice low, thick as winter syrup, in a dress not meant for rain. The woman nodded slowly, not meeting his eyes. "I don't remember falling," she said. Elam waited. "I walked for a day and a night," she continued. I think I was supposed to be someone's wife yesterday, but I ran. Or maybe I walked away so slow it didn't look like running." Her voice was cracked, not from weakness, but from the quiet strength of holding in too much for too long. Elam studied her face. There was no fear in her eyes, just a weariness too old for her years. "What's your name?" he asked finally. She hesitated. "Clara, just Clara." He nodded once and stood. "Well, Clara," he said, "you're safe now. No questions, no judgment, just that you're safe now." It was more mercy than she'd been given in years. For the next 2 days, Clara stayed in the little house on the prairie's edge. She moved like someone half-haunted, careful not to touch too much, afraid even her presence might leave stains behind. She helped sweep the porch, fed Jasper, who began to follow her like a shadow, mended a torn saddle blanket quietly, as if mending was a language she once spoke fluently. Elam said little, but he left fresh towels folded on the bed. He built a fire every evening and let it burn slow, letting the warmth speak where words might bruise. Sometimes they'd sit on the porch at dusk, not talking, just watching the sky fold itself into night. On the third evening, Clara said, "My father said a woman should be grateful to be chosen. That being chosen is all we're born for." Elam didn't respond right away. Then slowly he said, "That may be what he believed." But he was wrong. The words dropped between them like pebbles into deep water, soft but lasting. She looked over at him. "Do you believe people can begin again?" Elam took a long breath. "I believe people are beginning again all the time. Some just don't notice it till the story's already changed." That night, Clara cried for the first time since arriving, not from fear but from the simple shock of kindness. What happened to Clara before the storm led her here, and what truths has she left untold beneath her silence? By the 5th day, the silence between Elam and Clara had changed. It was no longer the silence of strangers. It had become something tender and tremulous, like the hush in a chapel before someone dares to pray out loud. But where comfort grows, so does fear, and what's buried begins to stir. That morning, Clara dropped a porcelain plate. It shattered across the wooden floor like gunfire. She didn't cry. She froze. Elam came in from the barn, boots heavy with mud. "It's all right," he said, gently crouching beside her. "Just a plate." But Clara didn't move. Her hand clutched the edge of the counter, white-knuckled. Her breath had gone shallow, chest tightening like something invisible had its hands on her again. He didn't ask, didn't push. But Jasper, ever quiet, leaned into her leg and sat still, warm, present, grounding. Eventually, Clara exhaled. Her fingers loosened. That night, they sat in front of the fire again. No porch watching, just the glow and the creak of old timbers around them. "You don't flinch," she said, breaking the quiet. "No reason to," Elam replied. "Most men I've known, their kindness has edges. It always comes back to what they want." She was looking into the fire, but her voice was clear now, like someone remembering a song they never got to finish. "I used to think if I said yes enough times, they'd stop asking. That if I smiled the right way, no one would grab my wrist. But kindness that comes with strings, that's just a rope in prettier fabric." Elam said nothing. He reached over, not to touch her, but to add another log to the fire. The flames jumped higher, a small, bright defiance. "I ain't that kind of man," he said finally. "And you don't owe me anything. Not warmth, not stories, not staying. You're not beholden." Clara looked at him, then really looked. And in that gaze was a storm she'd been holding back longer than she could remember. "I want to believe you," she whispered. "But I don't know how to believe anything anymore." He nodded. "That's all right. Belief don't have to come fast. Just honest." And then, as if some old wire snapped inside her, Clara stood and walked outside into the night air. The wind rushed past her, and she opened her arms wide to it, trembling. She didn't cry, but she shook the way prairie grass shakes after thunder passes through it. Inside, Elam didn't follow, but he left the door open, so that she would know she had somewhere to return to when she was ready. Because sometimes love doesn't follow you into your storm. Sometimes it just waits with a lantern until you're done raging. When the heart has been taught to fear safety, can it ever trust peace? The next morning, Clara found a tin box beside her plate at breakfast. Inside were seeds, not gold, not silver. Just humble packets, corn beans, carrots. Some hand-labeled, some nearly faded with time. "I figured the soil might listen better to you than to me," Elam said, sipping his coffee without looking up. She ran her fingers across the packets. "You're giving me a garden." "No," he replied. "You're giving yourself one. I'm just stepping out of its way." That was the first day Clara felt her feet belonged to the earth again. She rolled up her sleeves, dug through prairie dirt that still held the scent of last week's rain. She didn't plant fast. She planted like someone learning the shape of trust, and Elam, he gave her space, but not distance. He repaired the fence nearby, hauled water from the well. Sometimes he'd hand her a shovel, sometimes just an apple. They didn't talk about before, they talked about today, about how carrots need patience, how the wind from the south brings better growing weather, about Jasper, who now followed Clara like a tired old knight pledged to a new queen. One evening, as they watched the rows take shape, Clara said softly, "When I was a girl, I used to believe there was a door in the sky, a real one, and that if I ever prayed hard enough, it'd open, and I'd step into something better." Elam didn't laugh, didn't blink, and now he asked. She smiled, not big, not bright, but true. "Now I think the door's on the ground, hidden under things like kindness and quiet, and knowing you can say no and still be wanted." He looked at her but didn't speak. The moment didn't need it. Later that night she wandered to the back room, the one with the warped door. She placed her hand on the knob. It was dusty, rusted at the base. When Elam heard the creak, he came from the front room slow, cautious. "Been meaning to fix that door," he said almost apologetically. Clara looked at him. "Don't," she said. He raised a brow. She stepped aside, holding the door open with both hands. "Let me fix it." And together, without ceremony or hammer, they stood in the room that hadn't been touched in 10 years. Dust swirled like memory. The sun bled through the warped shutters. Elam reached for the curtain. Clara stopped him. "No," she said. "Leave the dust a little while. I want to see it dance." And it did, all around them, like old grief learning how to breathe again. When healing comes quiet and steady, can love finally find a home where it was once turned away? Autumn slid in quietly like a shawl pulled over the shoulders of the prairie. By now the carrots had started to break the soil. Beans had found their climb. And Clara, though she still walked softly through the house, no longer flinched when the wind slammed the screen door. The old warped room had become a sewing corner, a place for mending. Not just cloth, but the soft, persistent mending of spirit. Elam built a bench beneath the window, said nothing about it, just made space where none had been before. One Sunday afternoon, as the wind carried the scent of drying wheat, Clara stood on the porch holding a letter. She stared at it for a long time. "It's from him," she finally said, voice steady. Elam looked up from sharpening his blade. "I didn't think he'd write," she continued. "Thought maybe the shame would keep him silent." She opened it, read slowly, folded it again. "He says he forgives me," she murmured, "that he's taken another wife already, that he hopes I found somewhere safe to sit still." She laughed, not bitter, just tired. "I don't want to sit still," she said. "I want to plant. I want to build. I want to be somewhere that lets me change and still stay." Elam laid his blade aside, walked up the steps, stood beside her quiet. "Then maybe this place isn't where you stay," he said gently. "Maybe it's just where you remember who you are." She turned toward him. There was no storm in her eyes now, only reflection, and a question that had been trying to form for days. "Would you want me to stay?" she asked, her voice a thread of breath. He didn't smile, didn't rush. He simply said, "Only if it's what you want, not what you owe, not what I need, just what your heart dares to choose." She watched him as if measuring whether his stillness was truly safe, or just another silence that would cost her pieces of herself. Then she said, "I want to stay." And there it was, not a confession, not a climax, just the simplest act of hope, choosing to stay. Later that evening, Clara placed a kettle on the stove, the kind with a crooked handle and a stubborn whistle. She looked out the window. The prairie stretched golden and wide. The air hummed with late insects and the beginning of frost. She spoke softly, almost to herself. "I never thought love would look like this." Elam, sweeping dust from the porch, called back, "Like what?" She smiled. "Like a man fixing the fence beside you and not asking where you've been. Like a dog that waits at your door each morning. Like tea left steeping too long because someone took time to listen. Like being told you don't have to go if you don't want to." Elam didn't answer, but inside he poured 2 cups of tea, one for him, one for her, and placed them gently on the table where no one had sat across from him for 10 long years. Some people arrive like thunder. Others arrive like seasons, slow, patient, and impossible to forget. By late October, Clara began venturing into town again. At first, it was just the post office, a quick errand, eyes to the floor. Then the mercantile, the bakery, the feed store, small places, quiet nods. A few glances too long, a few whispers not meant to be heard. Elam never offered to walk beside her. He only hitched the wagon, handed her the reins, and said, "You come back when you're ready." But that day, after she walked out of the mercantile with a bag of flour in one hand and a dozen curious stares behind her, someone called her name, the full name she hadn't spoken aloud in months. Clara Belle Langston. She turned, slowly. Standing by the well was Mrs. Trudy Kelson, the widow who ran the sewing circle and remembered everything, including gossip that should have died years ago. "I thought it was you," Trudy said, voice taut with sugar. "We heard you ran out on poor Mr. Talbot. Right before the wedding, wasn't it?" Clara didn't flinch, just held the bag a little tighter. "I left," she said simply. Trudy leaned in, voice dropping to a whisper. "You shamed your family. You humiliated a good man. And now you're playing wife to the likes of Elam Granger. You do remember what folks say about him, don't you?" Clara met her eyes. For the first time in years, she didn't lower her gaze. "I remember what people said," she replied, "and none of it was ever kind or true." Trudy's mouth tightened, but Clara didn't wait for more. She turned, stepped into the wagon, and drove back into the prairie wind. At home, Elam was chopping wood sleeves, rolled brow slick with effort. When she walked up, he looked at her and paused. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded. But something in her chest was trembling, not from shame, but from the echo of a former life. "I forgot how sharp small words can be," she said. Elam leaned on the axe handle. "Folks will talk," he said. "That's all some know how to do. But what matters is whether you believe them more than you believe yourself." She walked past him into the house and stood at the window, watched the horizon blur under a thin cloud of dust. The prairie was wide, yes, but some words still managed to chase you across it. Later that night, she sat by the fire and said, "I used to think surviving was the same as living." Elam nodded slowly. "It ain't." She looked up. "But I want to. Live, I mean. Not hide, not bow. But I don't know how to do that without being ready to be hated." He stared into the flames. "Maybe love," he said, "ain't something you wait to feel safe to deserve. Maybe it's something you choose, even while the world's shouting that you shouldn't." She reached across the space between their chairs, not for his hand, but for the silence between them. She filled it with presence. "I don't want to be anyone's shame," she whispered. He looked at her steady whole. "You're not," he said. "You never were." And for the first time, she believed it. When the world points fingers, can two people still build something worth defending, even if it's only a quiet home in the tall grass? The first snow came before dawn. Not the kind that roars, but the kind that whispers. It fell gently across the prairie, blanketing the fields and fence posts like someone tucking in a child. Everything was still. Even the wind seemed to pause. In the quiet kitchen, Clara lit the stove and started the fire before Elam woke. She moved through the space as if she belonged there, not as a guest, not as a burden, but as someone who had chosen to stay. Her hands found the kettle, the bread tin, the quilt across the rocking chair. These were not borrowed things anymore. They were hers, too. When Elam stepped into the room, still pulling his suspenders over his shoulders, he paused in the doorway. "You always wake before the light?" he asked. She smiled, pouring hot water over tea leaves. "Only when I've decided I want to stay up for it." They ate in silence, the warm, easy kind of silence that comes from two people no longer afraid of being seen. Later that morning, they walked the fence line together. Jasper, slower now, but still loyal, trailed behind. The snow crunched underfoot. The sky was a soft gray like the inside of a wool coat. As they reached the ridge overlooking the wheat field, Clara stopped. She took a slow breath. "I've been thinking," she said. Elam glanced over. "That always means trouble." She nudged his arm, and for a moment she laughed, a sound that felt like church bells in winter. "I've been thinking," she repeated, "about building a coop. Chickens, maybe ducks come spring." He nodded. "You'd be good at that." She hesitated. "But only if we paint it green. The soft kind, like moss." He turned toward her, serious now. "Then green it'll be." They stood there a while, the prairie unfolding before them like a worn quilt. The house behind them. The future ahead, not promised, but possible. As they turned back, Clara said quietly, "When I first collapsed on your porch, I didn't want to be saved. I wanted to disappear." Elam didn't respond right away. He let her words settle. "But you didn't ask me to be anyone, or explain anything. You just made room." He looked at her, then truly looked. "I didn't make room, Clara," he said. "You were the room. I just stopped locking the door." They walked back without speaking, but their footsteps moved in rhythm like two notes finally finding the same key. That night, Clara lit a candle and placed it in the window, not as a beacon, not as a symbol, just as a way of saying, "This place is lit. This place is lived in. This place has room for warmth." As the wind picked up and the fire crackled low, Elam reached for a folded piece of paper from his desk drawer. It was a marriage license, one he had filled out a decade ago but never mailed. He placed it gently in front of her, didn't say a word. Clara looked at it, touched the edge, then smiled soft, sure. "Let's not have a wedding," she whispered. "Let's just keep having mornings like this." He nodded, folded the paper again and tucked it back into the drawer. And that was that. No vows, no music, just 2 cups on the table and a kettle set to boil. Because sometimes love doesn't ask for permission, it just waits until you're ready to come home. Sometimes love doesn't arrive with flowers or fanfare. Sometimes it shows up soaked in rain without a name, and still, it's exactly what the heart has been preparing for. What we saw today was not just the story of Elam and Clara. It was the story of silence learning to speak again, of 2 people who had every reason to give up choosing instead to stay to listen and to mend gently what life had once torn apart. If you've ever felt like it was too late for love, if you've ever built walls around your heart just to feel safe, maybe their story reminded you it's never too late to let someone in, and it's never wrong to start again. If this story touched something quiet in you, we invite you to subscribe to None Wild West Saga, where we tell stories of second chances, late love, and healing under open skies. Leave a comment, we'd love to know. Do you want to see what happens next for Elam and Clara, or hear more tales of the forgotten West and the people who dared to begin again? Share this story with someone who needs to know, even in the loneliest places. Hope still knocks. We're glad you stayed till the end. We hope you'll stay a little longer.